Start your wellness journey at Whole Foods Market, where it's Jumpstart January through the 16th. Stock up on supplements with some of the year's biggest savings. Plus, save on air-chilled organic boneless skinless chicken breasts, organic Honeycrisp apples, organic large Hass avocados, and more. And since Whole Foods Market is the only certified organic national grocer, it's easy to make them your wellness destination. Jumpstart your January now at Whole Foods Market.
Picture this nightmare scenario. You're hosting friends for the big game. It's neck and neck in the fourth quarter, and suddenly you realize you're out of drinks. Don't panic, because you can save on a huge selection of beer, wine, and spirits. Then get them delivered to your watch party with Drizzly, the go-to app for drink delivery. Download the Drizzly app or go to drizzly.com. That's DRIZLY.com. Must be 21 plus, not available in all locations.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Later in the show, we will speak once again to Nick DeMarco, KC, leading barrister in sports law, friend of the show, and he'll be telling us about the second edition of his book, Football and the Law, and answering some of your questions. And I think, Kieran, much as we love each other, we can both agree that it's worth people just listening to us blether on about news for 10 minutes to get to the Nick DeMarco bit, because it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, Nick was amazingly A, smart, and B, very open, I think, in terms of his answers. He is the number one sports barrister in the country for a reason, and that will become very evident when you see his measured, proportionate, but also very much on the money answers.
Well, I think that describes us as well, doesn't it, Kieran? Measured proportion? No.
No.
I can't. I couldn't get to the end of that sentence without breaking down. Before we talk to Nick, there are a couple of fairly big news stories, Kieran. The first is that Ukraine is going to join Spain and Portugal's bid for the 2030 World Cup. Is this a symbolic gesture, Kieran, or a genuinely financial one?
Ukraine was involved in the 2012 European Championships. It was a co-host there, and anybody who went to those matches would have had a great time. There are three potential hosts of the 2030 World Cup. So we've got an interesting one coming from a combined Egypt, Greece, and Saudi Arabian bid.
Oh.
I think we know where the funding for that is coming from, having just seen that Saudi Arabia is also planning a $400 billion snow dome to host the I think they're trying to host the equivalent of the Winter Olympics in Saudi Arabia, which will be an amazing achievement of architectural skill. So clearly, the money's there.
Will it be one of those snow domes that a giant hand could pick up and shake, and then it actually starts to snow? Because that would be worth seeing, wouldn't it?
That would be amazing. Yeah, that would be absolutely amazing. So that has had some traction. In addition, there is a bid from South America, from Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile. And then there was effectively a UEFA backed bid, because individual federations, what they normally say is that we will back a bid if we're allowed to, under sort of the roster system that they have at UEFA. So it was originally Spain and Portugal, but I think Zelensky has said that Ukraine would be willing, I think, to host one of the groups. Now, clearly, there are complications in 2022. We hope those complications are resolved as swiftly as possible, and that the people of Ukraine will be in a free and fair country, in a position where fans will be able to go, people will be able to go to attend matches, because although football is taking place in Ukraine at present, those places where it can physically take place, there's no crowds allowed, just in case Putin's mob, threaten that with some form of attack. So there is a political element to this. I think we cannot be naive in all of this, but at the same time, it would be a great final. And people saying, well, why are we now seeing joint hosts of tournaments? I think there's two key factors here. We all know that the host country automatically qualifies for the tournament. FIFA are increasing the number of teams who are participating in the FIFA World Cup tournament from 32 to 48. My spreadsheet isn't big enough to work out how much that's going to cost me in panini stickers. But I'm working on it, I can assure you. So there's 48 teams, which will allow more hosts. But also, you've only got to look to see what happened in both South Africa in 2010 and Brazil in 2014 to realise that hosting the World Cup from a financial perspective, and ultimately, this is a football finance show, is economically a disaster. Because you end up with a lot of mothballed stadiums which are costing a fortune to maintain. There's petitions taking place in Cape Town, for example, to demolish the stadium, which was effectively created on the waterfront. And I was lucky. I went to 3 matches there during the 2010 World Cup. Had one of the greatest times of my life as a fan, because everybody was so hospitable, and the fan zones were amazing. But like the best parties, there's always a big clear up operation. So those costs are going to be spread, and Ukraine could contribute to that in 2030. The vote is taking place, I think, at the FIFA Congress in 2024. So there's still a lot of time for politicking. England initially were offering to host the 2030 World Cup. And we're one of those countries which doesn't need a lot of change because the infrastructure is already there. But as always, in football, in finance, there's an element of politics as well. It looks as if the Football Association has agreed to quietly drop that bid in lieu of getting the nod for the 2028 Euro championships, along with Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. So we'll see what happens there.
Well, whoever gets to host the World Cup, Kieran, at least we know it will be as part of an open, transparent, and fair process. I'll just let that pause there, because in case some people don't know I'm being sarcastic. I've got nothing against joint bids. Okay, no. I mean, otherwise, football mad countries like Egypt, Greece that you mentioned, Belgium, Ireland, Uruguay, they're not going to be able to host a World Cup on their own, and I don't see why as many countries as possible shouldn't see World Cup games in their country. These are starting to be worrying times for Southend United fans, Kieran. The drums seem to be approaching, and there's more bad news for them this week, I feel.
Yes, there was a message put out by the front of shirt sponsors called PG Site Services, effectively saying a few days ago that they were withdrawing support, they were withdrawing sponsorship from the club due to, and I here use the words in quotation marks, financial dishonesty in terms of how that sponsorship was obtained. And clearly that's quite an inflammatory comment. That's clearly quite an emotional comment. And then that message was withdrawn, and we've seen something subsequently appear on the club website. Now, normally football clubs, press officers, when they've got something to say, they're quite happy to say it in as many words as they choose. I would describe this statement as terse. But it did say that following some publicity with regards to the sponsorship, they are now happy to confirm that the relationship with PG Site Services is going to carry on for the next 2.5 years. That the sponsors have withdrawn the comments that they've made on social media. So what exactly is going on behind the scenes, we're not certain. At the same time, Southend have been given a transfer embargo by the National League, and this is on the back of Southend United failing to make the requisite payments under HMRC's time to pay scheme. So, for people not familiar with this, during COVID, if people, COVID really hit clubs in lower football very significantly. HMRC said, we know that you're deducting money from VAT revenues. We know you're deducting, but you're effectively collecting money in terms of PAYE, and that money normally has to be paid across on a monthly or a quarterly basis to the tax authorities. What we're going to do in order to aid cash flow, combined with the furlough scheme, we're going to give you additional time and come up with some proposals with a view not paying the tax, but to paying it over a longer period of time. And that involves an element of trust. It looks as if Southend United have missed one of those payments, at least to HMRC. There were some mutterings, I think, in December 2021, also with some HMRC-related issues. So as a result of that, HMRC, they normally sort of do two strikes and you're out, or when they give people extra time to make financial commitments. So HMRC has now cancelled the time to pay scheme, effectively saying we want our money and we want our money now. The club owners are saying, well, we've got legitimate reasons, and it's we're innocent parties here, Gov. We could have taken a Premier League loan to pay off the tax, but we chose not to, as if that's some sort of virtue. My understanding is that quite a few clubs, did make the commitment to the Premier League loan, but there were conditions attached, as there are to all things, and for whatever reason, Southend didn't like those conditions, which doesn't necessarily reflect badly on the Premier League or well on Southend. I'll go into no more detail than that, but. We've now got that sort of drip of issues, falling out with a major revenue source, falling out with the tax authorities, issues in terms of staff not being paid on time. The owner, I'm not saying this because the owner's called Ron, but the owner is called Ron. The owner sort of saying that I'm the good guy in all this. And there's no doubt that the owner has put in money to the club. I cannot deny that. But the owner wanting to move the club away from Roots Hall to effectively more of an out of town location, that means that that Roots Hall is open for development. So I'm always uncomfortable with property related issues. Having seen what happened at Brighton. You've been through similar experiences at Palace where the club was sold, but the ground was sold to somebody else, and you yourself the repercussions and the complications that causes. There's too many red flags at Southend to make anybody feel particularly comfortable.
It may come as no surprise to you, Kieran, to know that I am familiar with HMRC's time to pay scheme because it was offered to people in the entertainment industry, and very handy it was too, until I forgot that there would come a time when I would have to pay. Which is why the first of the month is an anxious time. I think I'm paying them to about 2027, but never mind. It was there. I have to say, I found HMRC very solicitous in their dealings with people in my industry because we simply couldn't. Money that you'd put aside had to be used to live. Unfortunately, they understood that. This financial dishonesty, as you say, Kieran, is a strange choice of words, and I'm struggling to think what they could mean because it's them that pay the club money. That the club wouldn't be paying them money, would they? So it's not like they haven't been paid. So can you make a guess as to what that might mean?
I think when the club was ultimately the club's pitching, the club's saying, "Please give us some money." we're going to put this for towards X, Y, and Z, or X, Y, and Z even. And if the sponsors feel that they have acted in good faith, perhaps they've accelerated some of the payments. And this is pure speculation here, and that commitment from the sponsors has not been reciprocated. Perhaps the sponsors feel in making that comment, which of course we have to note has subsequently been withdrawn, that they were led along a path in order to get the club money ASAP when perhaps it wasn't as required, or perhaps it was being used for different commitments than they initially thought.
Yeah, it's probably best on a show where we have the country's leading sports barrister not to start speculating about things that might lead to him emailing us on behalf of Southend United in a couple of weeks' time. We've never fully established, Kieran, what the opposite of the naughty step is. But whatever it is, for you, Plymouth Argyle have certainly been on that step, the top step. And I think that you might have to invent a step above that, because they've done something this week, Kieran, that will, I imagine, make you very proud of them.
Yes, and also, we're going to Plymouth in December, so and one of the reasons we're going is because they do the right things again and again and again. We've had Simon Hallett on the show showing his philosophy, a bit like Jason at Grimsby and Andy and Mark Palios. They're in an industry which gets a lot of criticism. It is refreshing, I think, for us, because we both become quite jaundiced since starting this show, to know that there are good people out there who believe in the benefits of openness, transparency, governance, and so on. So what Plymouth have done, it's only the start of October. They're under no legal obligation to publish their accounts until the 31st of March. They're under no legal obligation to publish a full set of accounts, but they've said, well, we want to be open. We feel that by being open with fans, who it actually improves the relationship. You and I, we've both seen the huge affection with which Andy Holt is held at Accrington by fans there, but by just being upfront with people. So Plymouth have published their accounts. They're the first domestic people to do this, and people say, "Well, hold on, you covered Manchester United's accounts last week." Manchester United's accounts were published in New York, and remember, Manchester United is registered in the Cayman Islands, so it's under a slightly different regime, and it's a listed company, and so on. So Manchester United had to get their accounts out quite early to comply with New York Stock Exchange rulings. So Plymouth have come out with their accounts, and I would say that they're pretty damn solid. Revenue has doubled to over 11 million. I think it's certainly the highest I've seen in a set of Plymouth accounts. Although historically, and this is not a criticism of the previous owners, historically that they always used to produce a cut down version. It looks as if the thinking at the club is one of the things we've said on many an occasion. Football's a really dumb industry because you're open 25 days a year and the ground's doing nothing for 340. Yeah. What Plymouth are doing is that they are going down the hospitality route. And that, I think that's almost trebled compared to 2021. It's also indicative, and I think you've said yourself, Kevin, that you think that Plymouth are sort of, if we talk about sleeping giants or clubs that could get to the Premier League and have a big fan base there, Plymouth is one of those cities.
Oh yeah,
and I think that's reflected in the fact that whenever I've seen Plymouth go away, they always travel in numbers, and with the exception of Exeter and Torquay, there's not many short distances that they have to travel. But what is indicative of the size of the fan base was that even though 21-22 was a non-COVID year, they generated £650,000 from streaming rights. The iFollow system, I think it has got over its teething problems, and it is now proving to be an additional revenue source for clubs. So that's that's quite indicative of the level of support. And it was only slightly down on the figures from the previous season, which of course were hugely disrupted as a result of COVID. They've got cash in the bank, although I think that cash is being used for infrastructure projects because they want to expand the facilities. Since the year end, I think they've raised about another £4 million from investors. It's going into property assets. They're a club, and I know when we talk to Nick, one of the things he says that clubs have improved from a legal perspective since he started getting involved in football and the law. They've become far more legally aware of issues. Plymouth have got a financial strategy, and we don't support football clubs for financial strategy. But all I would say is, if you don't have one, you tend to end up in the poo. And it's good to see a club that seems to know where it's going, seems to know at what pace they should be trying to get there, and that allows you to deal with the ups and downs and the uncertainties of football from a much stronger position.
Yeah, spoiler alert here, Kieran. One of the other things we talk about, one of the many other things we talk to Nick DeMarco about, is the number of American-owned clubs in the Premier League, and it's possible that there may be another.
Yes. So, Everton Football Club. Everton is presently owned by Farhad Moshiri. There have been talks historically when the sanctions were imposed on Alisher Usmanov by the UK government. It meant that his sponsorship of Finch Farm, which is the training facilities, that was through one of his companies. Another one of his companies was front of shirt sponsor of the women's team, and so on. He'd also paid a very unusual £35 million for the potential naming rights of the new stadium. All of that has now had to cease, and people have been asking, okay, where are Everton going to get somewhere in the region of £500 million to fund the new stadium? And I travel on the train to Liverpool and through Liverpool, and you can see the progress which is being made, and it does look quite spectacular. The start, they've started to put in the corners and some of the stairwells and so on. So it is one of those amazing things. And when they do the final time lapse summary of the building of the new stadium, I think fans will be hugely impressed. But the elephant in the room is, okay, where's the money coming from? So there's been talk of a consortium involving an American investor called Kaminsky, who was involved with Peter Kenyon. Peter Kenyon was historically chief executive of Manchester United and then Chelsea. He was involved in the consortium to try to acquire Newcastle. So he's done the rounds, and I'll say no more than that. And then that all appeared to die. They approached Moshiri a few months ago with regards to a takeover. But then there was an article in the Financial Times last week, and I think this is indicative of, 10 years ago, nobody gave a damn about football finance, including the Financial Times, and that was perfectly understandable. The fact that they now have full-time journalists working on football stories, both in effectively in London and New York. So this, the FT would not publish an article unless they'd researched it, to say that the Kaminsky deal, never say never, £400 million deal would appear to be the price involved. Everton have sort of pushed back, saying, well, there's been no conversations that we're aware of, being very coy. That doesn't mean that we're not looking for some form of investment. But if it does take place, then we could have another American owner. And you and I, we both love America. I think American owners have something different to offer to some of the other owners that we have in the Premier League, and some of their ideas are progressive, and some of those ideas I would describe as restrictive. But you can't give sweeping generalizations, because different owners might have actually different perceptions themselves.
Yeah, there's some things I like about America, Kieran. The buffalo wings, for example. I could probably think of a few more. I wouldn't like to sweepingly generalise that I'm a huge fan of America. Of course, I'm a fan of most countries. I'm waffling, Kieran, as I don't really even want to introduce this next news story because it's annoying me. In fact, it's annoying me so much. I'm not even going to ask you. You just do it, Kieran. I'm going to scribble some notes here. I'm doodling now, Kieran.
Well, we had the Todd Bowley suggestion of North versus South. Now, and he seems to think that there's a bigger North versus South divide in this country than there is in the USA. We are now having a proposal of the All-Star Games, which will take place on a league basis. So a Premier League team versus La Liga versus Bundesliga. We'll throw in the MLS. We could throw in perhaps the Japanese, the J League. It's all of a sudden we've got a new competition. And is there an interest for this? Okay, I'll put my cards on the table here. There's not a lot of interest for it, I suspect, in England. But does that mean that's because we're being parochial, or does that it's just not part of our culture, not part of our history? If you were to have that tournament taking place in Saudi Arabia, for example, in Japan, in some of the international markets, I'm pretty certain that the tickets would sell. I'm pretty certain that the local TV rights in particular would be very high. But of course, it involves more games. And I've just seen a report looking at the number of injuries that were reported last year. Soft tissue industries amongst professional footballers. If you follow the likes of FIFPro, if you listen to the PFA, this is a cause for concern for their members. You cannot keep squeezing footballers until the pips squeak themselves, because they are professional athletes. Usain Bolt was brilliant, but it didn't mean that he should go and do 50 or 60 attempts to beat the 100 meters record in a single year. The whole thing about being a professional athlete is that you do need a proper regime of training, rest, recovery, diet, and so on, as well as competing in the sports themselves. So a lot of the proposals that we are seeing involve players playing more games. Then there's going to be complications. Who's going to be the coach of the Premier League team? Who's going to be the coach of the Bundesliga team? Is it going to be seen by some teams, especially some team managers and some team players, as a bit like an international friendly, and you start to get huge numbers of players dropping out? And my concern with all of these ideas, which involve more games, then somebody is thinking there has to be fewer games elsewhere. Now, my personal view is that we won't have a League Cup beyond 2024. This will be part of the negotiations between the EFL and the Premier League in terms of the effectively, it's not a bribe. It's a negotiation. But the Premier League gives more money to the EFL, and the EFL either abolishes the League Cup, or alternatively, it takes place with the clubs which are taking place in Europe not competing, or then putting in under-21 teams. And if anybody's taken a look at the Papa Johns, the under-21 teams of Premier League teams, even big teams, in the main, are getting an absolute pasting because there is a difference between more experienced professionals and people who are developing their trade. So the Carabao Cup, will either go or will be significantly changed. Certainly, we will see no more replays in the FA Cup, which is an income source for the smaller clubs. My big concern is this will be part of the drip, 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 which we are hearing a lot more of, reducing the Premier League to 18 teams. And let's declare self-interest here. I'm a Brighton fan. You're a... Sorry, what have I just said? I'm a Brighton fan. You're a Palace fan. We of our teams play 38 games a year, as do the fans of Villa, Leeds, Newcastle, Wolves, Leicester, West Ham. All sides who have done decently well. If you reduce the number of matches that our teams play from 38 to 34, and you increase the number of matches in the Champions League for the European clubs, the financial gap, which is already huge, gets bigger and bigger. It will be their players, the players of the Big Six, which will be representing the Premier League and the Bundesliga and so on. So they'll probably get more money from that. And what I don't see what's in it for the broader football fan base, and that's where my reservations are going, because these ideas all add up to the same thing: more money, more matches for the bigger teams, and increasingly lack of football balance as far as our showcase competition, which is the Premier League, is concerned.
I'm going to pitch this idea for a show to my agent. We'll wait till they've built that snow dome in Saudi Arabia and host it there. We'll get Michael McIntyre to introduce it. Premier League 11 will face the Bundesliga, and at half-time, Tyson Fury will fight Anthony Joshua. Think that'll make him happy? Two more stories, Kieran. The first one I can only describe as Barcelona's still getting away with
it. Barcelona's credit card, Blimey O'Reilly, they know how to use that. I develop a nervous tick when the Baroness says, "I'm going up to Cheshire to see some of my friends, and I'll be going to the Big John Lewis." And I hide under a cushion for about 6 hours, but Barcelona, as we know, they've had financial challenges. They've used their economic levers as a means of addressing and overcoming the financial challenges that they've been given. They've also been using the club credit card as a means of acquiring players. And let's be honest, this is a common feature of modern-day football. When players are signed, they are signed on credit. Transfers are made on instalments. We all understand that, and very few people are in a position where they can write out a check for 60 or 70 million pounds at the drop of a hat. So that makes a lot of sense. I absolutely get that. Barcelona owe 144 million euro in respect of players that they've signed. Again, I don't actually have a huge issue as far as that's concerned. Manchester United owe 182 million. Nobody, and that was before they went, disco loopy this summer in terms of buying players. What makes me feel slightly uneasy is that Barcelona still owe money on instalments for Philippe Coutinho. They owe that money to Liverpool Football Club. And people go, hold on, haven't they sold Philippe Coutinho to Aston Villa?
Yeah.
And indeed they have. Now, my understanding is that if that was a domestic transfer, if Coutinho had gone from, say, Liverpool to Chelsea to Villa, I may have got this wrong, but I was listening to somebody who said, well, under those circumstances, when the players sold on to another domestic club, Chelsea would have had to go and pay all of the final instalments to Liverpool as part of the deal. But in international deals, that is not the case. So Barcelona have sold Philippe Coutinho. They've also sold Pjanic, who they acquired from Juventus in what was a fairly controversial deal as well. He's departed, but they owe instalments in respect of that deal to Juventus. So they owe 50 million euro to two other clubs in respect of players who are no longer at their club. And that That just doesn't lie particularly easy with me, but it's perfectly legal as far as UEFA rules are concerned.
Yeah, perhaps we should get a Real Madrid fan on to see what they think. Just before that Nick DeMarco interview, if you're planning to go to the World Cup in Qatar in a few weeks' time, and you're thinking to yourself, I'll just watch a couple of the games in a hotel bar, might have some bad news for you.
You're absolutely right here, Kevin. It looks as if the rights holder for the World Cup broadcasting rights, which is beIN Sports, the employer of Richard Keys, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I
Let's
don't have strong opinions on many things, but I do have quite a strong opinion when it comes to Richard Keys.
Yeah, let's not go there, Kieran.
I'm not going to go there.
This pod's quite a long one as it is without getting into stories of that weasel. So
yes. So it looks as if beIN Sports are going to charge hotels and bars 100,000 Qatari riyals, which is approximately £24,000, if they want to show the matches on their premises. Now, if you talk to a pub owner, if you talk, I play for Trafford Cricket Club, and we've got a rugby club there as well. We have to pay a lot more to Sky and BT Sports for the rights to show their products in a commercial place, and we understand why, because it attracts people to come to the bars to drink more. So the hotel, the pub, whatever it is going to generate more money. But £24,000, and it looks as if there could be some pushback here from some of the hotels, from some of the bars, and so on. If you're thinking of using Airbnb and effectively renting a place in Qatar, where your landlord actually stands in terms of it, is this a personal dwelling? Is this a commercial dwelling? That appears to be uncertain as well. It does look as if the Qatari authorities are relaxing some of the alcohol rules. First of all, there's going to be a drop in the price of alcohol. I think it is around about £12 to £15 a pint, because clearly there are restrictions for legal and cultural reasons in Qatar. I think the price is dropping to around about £7 to £8 a pint, which as you know, I don't drink alcohol, but that still strikes me as even West Ham aren't charging quite as much as that. And also, there's going to be increased hours in which alcohol is to be made available. But you're normally drinking this alcohol in the bar, watching the football. Now, if the bar cannot afford to show the football, we could be left with a complication. Therefore, you might say, okay, I know, I'll go to the fan zone. And I've been to fan zones at World Cups. I've been going along, and 2006 in Germany was absolutely amazing. I don't think I've ever been covered in more alcohol than when I went to see Germany play Sweden. I think it's either the last 16 or the last 8. So full of German fans. Germany scored twice in the first 15 minutes, and there was joy and celebration and alcohol thrown. But if you're thinking of going to the fan zone, it looks as if you're going to have to pay for the privilege, and it could be that it's going to cost you £75 to get in, and then that's before you start paying for your drinks. So I'm not quite sure what the objective or the strategy. And I spoke a bit earlier. Part of my praise for Plymouth Argyle is that they do have a definite strategy, trying to work out what the strategy is here of combination of FIFA, Qatar, beIN Sports, and everybody else involved. Their perception of what a fan can do, wants to do, and what that the fan can afford does appear to be at odds, because also the cost of accommodation seems very, very expensive as well.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, first of all, Kieran, if you're paying £8 or £9 a pint, you probably aren't going to throw it, even if you score a goal in the last minute. My understanding is, I've been doing some research on this recently, that the fan zone £75 ticket, one of them gets you free access to a beach, so that's handy. But there's a lot of people saying that the authorities in Qatar, as you hinted at, have absolutely no idea about European, South American fan culture and are totally unprepared for it. And there's all sorts of rumblings about infrastructure still not being ready. Some of the fan accommodation, the cheapest ones, are literally balsa wood huts or tents with a bed in, and are 40 miles away from Doha, which takes a lot of doing because it's a tiny country. So I think those people who assumed that it would be a super efficient World Cup because it's a super rich country might be in for a slight surprise. But it's time, Kieran, we've been teasing it long enough. Nick DeMarco is, I think it's fair to say, is a legal equivalent of you, Kieran, except he's the leading barrister in sports law in this country. He's an author too. The second edition of his book, Football and the Law, has just been released. So we asked Nick to talk a little about that and also to answer some of our listeners' questions.
Start your wellness journey at Whole Foods Market, where it's Jumpstart January through the 16th. Stock up on supplements with some of the year's biggest savings. Plus, save on air-chilled organic boneless skinless chicken breasts, organic Honeycrisp apples, organic large Hass avocados, and more. And since Whole Foods Market is the only certified organic national grocer, it's easy to make them your wellness destination. Jumpstart your January now at Whole Foods Market.
Nick, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for agreeing to answer some questions from our listeners and essentially give free legal advice to some of them. Before we do that, the book has been incredibly well received. Did you enjoy writing it, and what made you decide that it was needed?
Well, it's the second edition, so we first decided it was needed a few years ago, and I think it was because more and more of us, that those of us who practice in this area, both at the bar and solicitors, were finding that that there is increasingly a particular area of practice just around football, because it's the biggest and best sport in the world, but it's also got the most money. Certainly in England, English football is such a great success story, and there are issues in football that arise that are quite unique to football and don't arise in other sports. And we just realized there was that gap in the market, that there wasn't a book that was helpful for anyone. Could be a lawyer, could be someone at a football club, whoever, who's got a particular issue, and you want one place which is practically useful where you can go and look for the answer. And that was the idea behind the book, and it was the first book in the world to do that, very well received. And so we've sort of updated it, brought in new authors, added some new chapters, and got the second edition, which I think is much improved to the first. And that's really the point of it. I always do try and say to people who might not be lawyers that it's not like a novel. You're not meant to read it cover to cover. You can if you want to. I've heard some people do, but it's the type of book I use in my practice, and hopefully other people will, where you've got a particular problem and you want one place to look up the answer, or at least to know where to start to look elsewhere for the answer. And that's what I hope the book does. I certainly use it myself when I've got a new case. Let me look up my own book because I think we cover that somewhere. So that's what the point is. And it seems to be doing that. So we're very pleased about that.
By my estimation, Nick, there are probably about 25 million pub lawyers in this country. It's amazing how many people you talk to before a football match who are convinced they know about the law and are 99% of the time wrong. Are you often surprised by the ignorance of people at a high level in football of the law? Because there's a lot of people who assume they know the law without checking that they're right, and they, as I say, they aren't often.
Well, I used to be surprised by it. I'm rarely surprised now, partly because things are a lot better now than when I started. And I remember one of my first football cases, and it was literally not a contract, but an agreement to cover the payment of a player's wages that had been scribbled on the back of an envelope in a bar between, a rich supporter of a club and a club with not much money. And then you have all sorts of arguments about it. And so, you're talking about big contracts and going back, 15, 20 years, very few clubs even employing lawyers, often having rich benefactors who in their own companies would be very careful about how they spent their money, but suddenly seem to lose all sense of professionalism when they were running football clubs. And so things now are a lot better than they were then. That's not to say that there's not still a lot of that. So I'm probably much less surprised than I would have been. But certainly, it's one of the things I learned early being a football lawyer is to be used to that sort of thing. And when I've seen some of my colleagues and they get involved in a football case, they can be if they're not used to it before, they can be very surprised at the sort of level of preparation that there might be, given the money's at stake. It's quite different to other areas even now. But as I say, it's become a lot more professional. As for fans, yes, of course, you get all kinds of views, whether it's about football, the football itself, the fans are the best managers, experts at everything, or about the law or whatever else. But it's also fair to say that often they're spot on and they come up with good, interesting ideas that some lawyers haven't. So I give them credit too.
It's no surprise to know, Nick, that we've had many, many questions. It's into three figures, so we've had to whittle them down. And I suspect we may not have time to get through the selection that we have chosen. But let's kick off with one from Dan Connors, which is a fairly general one. But Dan Connors says he's interested to hear your thoughts, Nick, on what areas of football the legal profession are currently not involved in that he thinks that might be in the future.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. If I knew, I would have put a chapter in our book about it. Because I've tried to put a chapter about everything that arises. But no, I think one of the emerging areas, the emerging sexy areas you hear about is NFTs and fan tokens and these sort of Jack in the Beanstalk things that are coming in, and I think that could cause some litigation. I think generally fans' rights, consumer rights is an area that we may see grow. So I think that's one to look out for. But another one is the whole issue about one of Kieran's pet subjects, I believe, the independent football regulator.
Yeah.
If it comes in, then what a lot of people haven't focused on, and what interests me as a lawyer, is it would almost certainly be reviewable by the courts in what's called judicial review. So the FA, for instance, or the leagues, they're all private bodies. And that means that you can't take them to court. But if you have an independent statutory regulator, you could take it to court. And I think that could mean, for example, clubs might say, well, hold on, independent statutory regulator, you haven't properly enforced a financial fair play rule against this other club. And they might then review that decision. And you may even have interested fan groups having standing to bring claims against the independent regulator. And the other big difference that would mean is that these decisions would be played out in the High Court and in public for the first time and not in private arbitration. So all of that is a very interesting unintended consequence, perhaps, of this statutory regulator if it comes in.
And of course, you've always argued that private arbitration is much better than going to court, haven't you?
Is that a joke or
no?
I have very mixed feelings about it, Kevin. I think there are great advantages for private arbitration, but I also think in sport it can there's a huge tension there, because unlike normal commercial arbitration between two companies who are shipping goods around the world, a lot of these sports arbitrations are about rules that affect all the parties and have to be applied fairly as between all of those parties, and for them to be determined entirely privately behind closed doors, where even the other parties don't get to have a say or even know what the result is sometimes, as with Premier League arbitration, I think is problematic. So I think there's a very good argument in sports arbitration for hearings to be considered, some of them to be in public and not in private. Of course, you can have confidential commercial information could be dealt with in private, but I think there's a move now gradually towards more of this being in public, even though a lot of the regulators aren't too keen on that.
You found a very good way of confusing a professional comedian there by asking them if that's a joke. That always baffles us. Rose Lawrence is one of many people to ask a question I suspect most lawyers are asked at some stage in their career, certainly most barristers. And I've paraphrased it slightly. When you take a case on, do you sometimes do so for professional reasons or out of academic interest, or do you have to believe in the justice of that case before you accept it?
Yes, well, the answer is that we have what's called, rather quaintly, and I think it's spectacularly misnamed, the cab rank rule as barristers. It's one of our code of conduct, and I say it's spectacularly misnamed because it's based on the idea that when you hail a cab, they'll take you to wherever you want to go, and they'll never say, sorry, I'm not going south of the river, mate. Which is not my experience necessarily. And so the idea is that we should take on any case that's within our area of expertise, so long as we've got the time for it and so on. And there's a good reason for that concept. Anyone, however unpopular or despised they are, should have access to the best lawyer. And if people pick and choose their clients depending on their own personal beliefs, you end up not having that system. So professionally, we are obliged to take on whatever case. And the second point is that I think you're a better lawyer if you are able to see both sides of an argument. Then there normally are two sides of an argument. And if you act for both sides in different cases, if you act for a party you might not disagree with, but have to put forward arguments on its behalf, I think you become a better lawyer and you have a better judgment and objectivity. So generally speaking, no, you take on cases because they are interesting, of course, but also because you're a barrister and it's a case that's come to you and you should be taking it on unless you're too busy or it's something you can't do. Of course, the most interesting cases you enjoy the most, and if you're academically interested in it or committed to the result, you may be happier when you win. But I often am acting for parties I don't necessarily agree with, and just because I act for them isn't a sign of my own personal views. My personal views are entirely separate to those I put on behalf of the client. And again, that's important for a judge. If you're in front of a judge and they're listening to you, they don't want to hear your personal views, and they don't want to think, oh God, it's DeMarco again. He's always going to argue the same thing. They want to be persuaded that the answer is legally correct, and so that level of independence is important for a barrister.
Mark Collins asks this question: is the threshold for a criminal charge of assault or ABH different on a football pitch to a town centre on a Friday night?
Basically, yes. It of course depends on the circumstances, as we lawyers say in response to just about every question. But it's really all about consent. You think of it in one extreme. Think about boxing. Boxers consent to enter a competition where they both try and inflict serious damage to each other by throwing punches at each other's heads and trying to knock the other one out unconscious. Now, they're not going to get arrested for assault for doing that, because that they have consented to that sport. In football, footballers consent to a contact sport that involves tackling and competing for a ball that can cause injury. And so the mere doing of those things is not going to lead to a criminal charge. But that doesn't mean to say that you can deliberately aim to break someone's leg, regardless of where the ball is, because you've got a grudge against them on a football field. It's different. But, if I was out on a Friday night in the town centre and someone came and tackled me for my pint, they would probably be done for assault because I hadn't consented to that. And so there is that difference.
Okay, we have a question from an Irish listener, friend of the show, Colm Hand. And again, this particular club has been mentioned several times. Colm says there's been movement towards cross-border breakaway leagues in recent years, and now we've seen FC Swift Hesperange in Luxembourg challenging UEFA to allow them to compete elsewhere. Are there any laws that specifically stop leagues from merging? And I know as well off the back of that, I know quite a few Glasgow Rangers fans who are looking at that Luxembourg case because they think that might be the loophole that they need to escape from Scottish football and perhaps get into the English league.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question. The breakaway league, that case, and also the Super League case, and there's also in golf, there's a Live Sport case going on at the moment. Breakaway leagues, I think, is something we're going to see a lot more of and a lot more cases about it. Ultimately, and a lawyer might not normally say this, I don't think this is ultimately a legal question. There are very important legal arguments about this on both sides, but ultimately I think this is a commercial question. If you look back, the Premier League was a breakaway league, wasn't it? It broke away from the Football League. There were court cases about it. The FA and the Football League tried to stop it, but there was a momentum behind it. There was the Sky money. And ultimately, it was a great success, and it's continued to be now integrated as part of our league system, and a great success for English football for all its faults. On the other hand, the recent Super League was a complete failure, and it was a failure not only because of the legal obstacles it faced, but I think much more so when we look back, it was a failure, wasn't it? Because it was so unpopular. It was about the only thing that united every politician in England that I can remember, and every football fan, including the fans of the clubs who were trying to break away. It became so unpopular that commercially it became unviable from the start. And I think that those matters are ultimately more important, and the law will follow and adapt to those changes rather than ultimately be the decisive factor, in my view.
Michael Saibenga asks about the recent Newcastle takeover saga, which of course you were involved with. Michael says there's a lot of talk of the top six clubs, the so-called Super Six clubs, trying to stop the takeover going through, and then subsequently, post-takeover, trying to stop Newcastle growing as a club by restricting income growth. Do you think there's any likelihood of anti-competition case being brought against Premier League clubs, or the Premier League as a whole, or maybe even against UEFA for FFP rules, which appear to prevent ambitious clubs from competing with the established ones?
Well, there already has been one competition law case against UEFA in relation to their FFP rules. That failed. And there will almost certainly be future ones, both against UEFA and the Premier League, in relation to all sorts of matters, including the ones Michael is talking about. Those sorts of cases are very complex because you have to establish, it's far too much to talk about in a short answer, but you have to establish many things to get a competition law case off the ground, not just that something is anti-competitive, but ultimately you come down to a question, if you can establish something is anti-competitive, take financial fair play, for example. That is obviously anti-competitive because it restrains competition. It restrains the amount a club can invest. If you establish it's at least arguably anti-competitive, the real issue then is whether it is justified by some legitimate objective that is proportionate. That's the legal language they use. And in FFP, the objective is said to be financial stability. And if the measures imposed encourage financial stability, and they don't go further than is necessary to encourage financial stability, courts and tribunals will generally say it's a justified restraint on competition. And those are the sort of questions you have to look at. And so it's whether a particular act or a particular rule or measure goes further than necessary for whatever the legitimate interest is. And in those cases, competition law challenges may succeed.
This is a very interesting question, I think, Nick. It wasn't asked for you specifically, it was asked to us, but we decided only you could answer it. And again, it's about Newcastle. Gareth Nunn says, could a player at Newcastle who was signed under the Mike Ashley regime ask for his contract to be ripped up because the current owners hold political and cultural views different from his own?
Well, lawyers like me normally say there's two sides to every question and don't give you a straight answer. But here I can probably give you a straight answer, which is no. Right. Generally speaking, in employment law, any employer, whether a football player or whoever it is, doesn't have a right to rip up his or her contract of employment because they have different views to their bosses. And you could imagine the carnage if you could rip up your contract of employment because you hold a different view. And of course, if that was mutual, which it ought to be in an employment contract, then bosses could fire workers because they disagreed with them. So the whole thing would be crazy. So no, that wouldn't work. But what is a more interesting question, I think, and is related, and Newcastle fans should remember, is the religion and belief discrimination that can arise. So and Newcastle fans may remember Pape Cissé and Demba Ba not wanting to wear the Wonga Payday Loan Company branded shirts when Newcastle had those on grounds of their religious belief against usury. And you can see that becomes slightly different because you're a football player and you're required to promote something, let's say betting or gambling, that may be fundamentally against one of your beliefs which is protected in law. And so there may be slightly more complex arguments. But even then, in my view, it's unlikely that the players would be able to refuse to comply with their contract, which includes promoting the club's official sponsor and so on. But those are probably the more likely areas for litigation.
Now, by way of a refreshing sorbet, Nick, before we carry on with the legal questions, Holly Blades is also a Newcastle fan, but she's just got a football question for you. We know you're a big football fan. Her question is, where do you think Newcastle will finish in the table this season?
Well, at the beginning of the season, I predicted they'd be in the top 10, and I would still hold to that. I think, I think, and I hope they will be there. Exactly where I don't know. Maybe 7 or 8 would be good and possible. It's difficult to say. I think both Newcastle is a great club. It's great to see it competing. Another club I follow, you'll be pleased to hear, is Brighton, another good client of mine. And I think both Newcastle and Brighton have had a great start and could both finish within the top 10. And one of them might just get to upset the top 6. I think that's possible this year, and it would be great if one of them could.
I almost was about to say I'm legally bound to say this, but of course, as you know, I'm not legally bound to say it. I'm honour bound to point out that Brighton haven't played anybody yet. That's as simple as that. We'll come
only
back.
Liverpool. Yeah.
Well, they've played Liverpool. They got a point the same way we did. So we'll come back to that one on New Year's Day. Our next question comes from Nobby Clark. Nobby Clark is a Palace fan. He drinks in the same pub as me pre-match.
Good.
And I'm having to paraphrase his question as I go along because it's got lots of clauses. But basically, Nobby says we've talked about recently on the pod quite a few clubs getting relatively paltry fines from UEFA for breaches of FFP. And Nobby says in the past decade or so, the UK has started to follow the common US practice of applying such fines to individual directors of companies, as well as the company itself. Is there any reason why UEFA couldn't do the same? And if so, do you think this might dissuade clubs from flaunting FFP?
Well, I think that it's generally speaking unnecessary and ought to be avoided to hold individual directors liable. I say generally speaking because it depends on what they've done. Let's say a club has breached FFP. In most cases where clubs breach FFP, you've got a reasonable difference of opinion between about accounting standards, for example, between a club and its auditors and the regulator. And so I don't see why a director should be personally punished for that. It's different if a director is personally involved in some deliberate dishonest act, for example, hiding payments or something like that. In those sort of exceptional circumstances where there's some dishonesty, then one can see it may be necessary to go after an individual director as well as the club. But those are rare cases, and it's also harder to prove dishonesty than simply a difference in accounting standards for obvious reasons. In the Sheffield Wednesday case, for example, that I was involved in, the EFL did initially bring individual charges against some of the directors, but it had to drop them and just go after the club because of the high standards of trying to prove something like dishonesty. So I don't think in FFP cases you're likely to see that. I have in other cases, in FA cases, there's an increasing tendency to go after individual directors where they've breached a rule about payments to agents and so on. But generally speaking, I don't think we will see that tendency.
We have 3 questions to go, Nick, because I know we're asking a lot of you time-wise. The first of these questions is one of the shortest, but I suspect may lead to one of the longer answers. It comes from Tom Lawrence. And Tom says, as we become increasingly American-owned in the Premier League, would Nick have a view on the legality of the Premier League becoming a closed shop or franchise league? And just to give that a bit of context, Nick, I mean, this was something we used to joke about as a scenario, but I believe it's now 10 clubs in the Premier League have a majority owned by Americans. And as we know, you only need 14 to institute a major change. So this is an issue that's of growing concern. And also a supplementary question to you. I don't think, I know Kieran believes that the government would get involved to prevent any change to the Premier League, but then surely that would involve FIFA, because FIFA don't like government interference in any football, do they?
They don't like it unless it's something that they agree with. So, do you remember Boris Johnson threatened a legislative bomb, I think was his words, if the Super League went ahead. And FIFA, who were also against the Super League at the time very strongly, didn't say a word about that. So,
okay.
It all depends, doesn't it? It's like everything with these points. And it is, I do repeat my last answer. In these areas, as we say in our football and the law book, law follows the money and football follows the money. And ultimately, this is a commercial and political decision, I think. I hope we do not have a closed shop or franchise league, not only because I think it would be terrible for the fans, but I also think it would be a commercial disaster because relegation from and promotion to the Premier League is one of those areas that creates some of the most excitement and brings in the most money to those who watch the Premier League and also bringing in new clubs. We're looking at Brighton now, Crystal Palace, Leicester, those sort of clubs who aren't necessarily always been in the Premier League, or even Manchester City 20 years ago were not in the Manchester City, were not in the Premier League. So I think it would be a disaster to have a closed shop, but ultimately these are commercial questions and the law will adapt to them. There'll be legal arguments on both sides, but it won't be resolved by lawyers, in my view. We'll just be there arguing the cases. It will be resolved by where the money is, where the support is. As I say, the Premier League succeeded when it formed. The Super League was a disaster. Neither of those were ultimately legal questions.
It's slightly worrying, Nick, to almost hear you imply that money sometimes trumps the law, or can trump the law, or trump the will to do anything about the law.
It's not that surprising, though, is it? I mean,
No, it's
sports
worse.
law, it's a way of the world. Sports law as a concept is something that has generally developed with the commercialization of sport. The idea of lawyers being able to argue about the rights of players or clubs and reviewing decisions of regulators, all of these things have become increasingly common as a result of the fact that more money is at stake in legal disputes in sport and in football in particular, and that's how law has developed. Law has developed with commerce. Law is not some immutable thing that stands above society and is always the same and unchanging. It is something, I think, that's developed with society, and one sees that in sport.
Our penultimate question, Nick, comes from Marcia Big. Marcia is a Chesterfield fan, and this is an issue that I know she feels very strongly about. It's about the PFA, the Professional Footballers Association, and National League players. The National League itself is classified as an elite league, which meant it carried on playing during COVID. Despite this, and the fact that the majority of teams are full-time, the National League is not classed as a professional league, which means that players can't join the PFA unless they've been part of a professional setup before. This impacts the treatment of injured players, as seen at my club Chesterfield, where Kabi Shimanga was able to get treatment at St George's Park, yet despite playing in the same team, George Carline wasn't. Is there a way for someone to challenge the FA, the National League or the PFA to change the National League status so that there is more parity between players? And it does seem an odd one, isn't it, that a player in one team can get treatment that might affect the rest of his career, the rest of his life, and another one can't.
Yes. As someone who acts for both the PFA and the National League,
okay, I know where this
regularly,
is going.
Often, I'll be careful what I say. Yeah. But I think Marcia does have a point, and I think we're in a different situation now than we were before. I mean, I remember when I started acting as a sports lawyer, doing the odd case for a National League club, then the Conference Club. Mainly because I was really cheap in those days and the clubs had no money whatsoever. But now I still do such cases occasionally, and I've noticed a huge difference. When I did cases back then, 15, 20 years ago, it was rare to have a professional player in the National League or the then Conference. Yeah. Now it's rare not to have a professional player in the National League. And so where most of the players have professional contracts, it seems to me that it ought to be recognised as so, and hopefully it will in the future.
Our last question, it comes from Liam Reynolds, and it reflects the fact that most football fans these days will desperately look for some kind of legal loophole to prevent their relegation or to stop another team they don't like going up. Liam is an Aston Villa fan, and he recalls, as I'm sure you do, that during the COVID lockdown Premier League season, it was a game between Villa and Sheffield United where the ball crossed the line, but because of a Hawkeye irregularity, somebody was in the way, it wasn't given as a goal. The game finished 0-0, and then Villa ended up staying up by 1 point, with Watford relegated instead of them. Would Watford have any right to claim, because of that, financial compensation? And if so, would they claim it from Aston Villa or would they claim it from the operators of Hawkeye?
It's a good question, and you're right, Kevin, that not only supporters but also club owners look at this sort of thing a lot more now because of the cost of relegation. I think, in fact, it was Bournemouth, because I look back, because I remember this, both Bournemouth and Watford were relegated with 1 point less than Villa, but Bournemouth had slightly better goal difference, so Bournemouth were in third from bottom. So it would have been Bournemouth's claim and not Watford's claim. But in any event, would there be a claim? If there was a claim, who would it be against? It's a difficult one, but these things are, challenging ones are the types of things that are my bread and butter. So it's certainly worth looking at. If there was a claim, I think the most likely respondent would not be Villa or Hawkeye, but the Premier League, because the Premier League are responsible for the arrangements with Hawkeye. And Villa didn't actually do anything wrong. It's not like the old West Ham Tevez case where West Ham were found to have breached the rules, and that breach in playing Tevez was found to have relegated Sheffield United because it gave West Ham at least one more point. Here, Villa haven't breached any rule, but have the Premier League failed in some kind of duty to a relegated club by either not having Hawkeye working properly or not taking steps to correct it? Again, perhaps difficult claim, but I think that's where you'd be looking.
It's interesting, wasn't it? At the end of last season, we saw Leeds and Burnley muttering dark threats about taking the Premier League, not to court, but certainly asking why the Premier League weren't doing more to stop Everton buying players because of FFP rules. And then as soon as Leeds stayed up, they, of course, stopped the dark mutterings. I presume that's fairly common in football, is it, that people threaten legal action until whatever they worry about happening doesn't happen to them?
Well, having been involved in that particular case, I couldn't possibly comment. But I think you'd be right to assume that, generally speaking, it's bound to be true, isn't it? That if you have avoided relegation, you're less likely to pursue something than if you have suffered relegation as a result of something you think is a breach.
I was getting a bit antsy, Nick, that you hadn't said I couldn't possibly comment up till now, but now you have done. I think that seems a good place. I can't thank you enough for answering those questions, Nick. I can't wait to read the book. It's Football and the Law, which is available now, and I'm sure many of our listeners will be very interested in buying it and reading it. And we wish you every success with that, and I'm sure we will be asking you on the show in future. Are you still going down to QPR?
Yes, I'm going on Friday. We had a great win away. Don't know when we had a great win away at Sheffield United.
Yeah,
Friday
fantastic.
At home to Reading. It's almost a derby, so it's a super hoops against a fake hoops. So I can't wait.
I tell you what, people who haven't been, it's always going to be Loftus Road. I know it's different now. People who haven't been to QPR. The atmosphere at QPR for an evening game is as good as anywhere in the country, I think. It's amazing. A full house, QPR evening game, it's brilliant. People used to talk about the old West Ham ground and they talk about Selhurst Park now, but it's a fantastic atmosphere at QPR. It's a great club, isn't it?
No, it is. It is really great. And you guys, thanks for having me on the show. It's a great show. I really enjoy listening to it. So you do a brilliant job.
Nick, thank you very much. So do you. It's been a pleasure. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye now.
Cheers.
We could have been there all day, Kieran. Well, we certainly had enough questions to keep in there all day, but obviously there are time constraints. It took a while to get him back because Guy worried that we might have to pay him his barrister rate once we resolve that. It's good to hear him talk about football, but I say some of these answers really fascinated me, and I hope Marcia at least is happy with the answer to her question, because I know that's been bothering her. And I think of all the big issues that we talked about, that was the one that legally most concerned me, because that's a strange anomaly. But I think Nick DeMarco is certainly one of those people that we will be getting back on the pod in the near future, hopefully, because there's always going to be questions to be asked. And it's interesting, isn't it, Kieran? You talked about football finance just early on in the pod. Only in the last 20 years, 10 years even, have people taken it seriously. And as Nick says, it's the same with the law. Like 10 years ago, people who ran football clubs had as much idea of the law relating to football as people who drink in pubs, i.e. not much.
Yes, and I think also the phrase which Nick used, I think perhaps on more than one occasion, is that football follows the money, and football law follows the money, and football finance follows the money, because all of a sudden the monetary consequences of a decision from a legal perspective or from a financial perspective have such huge implications in terms of club funding, in terms of transfer strategy, in terms of expansion of the club, in terms of European participation potential, and so on, that clubs are taking it very seriously. I agree with you. I could listen to Nick all day. because I always thought that lawyers would talk in a language which I didn't understand, because if ever I've read a contract, when I'm buying a house or getting involved in something, I could never understand what they wrote in terms of legal jargon. But Nick is absolutely brilliant. He cuts through all that, and he's very direct, and he's very measured, and I thought his answers were superb.
So thank you to Nick, and thank you to everyone who's donated to the pod via our Patreon page. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution as well, then go to patreon.com/priceoffootball. Our next live show, remember, as we said, will take place at Plymouth Argyle's home park on Tuesday the 13th of December. Tickets are now available for Plymouth Argyle's website. There's only a couple available, so get in quick. And if you have a question you'd like answered on the show, email us at questions@priceoffootball.com. In the meantime, I shall hand you over to Mr. Kieran Maguire for his customary farewell.
Well, thanks as always, folks, for all the interest you take in the show, and thanks for everybody that wrote in those questions for Nick. We had loads and loads more, but we I think out of respect for Nick, he is he's a man in demand from many sources, and he kindly gave us some of his time. We had to cut those down. Patreon is one way of supporting the show for as little as £1 a month, but there's another way that you can show us a bit of positive vibes, and that's to go onto your podcast app, and if you can give us a review, it does help us. It keeps interest as far as the algorithms of Spotify and Apple are concerned. And if you think we're worth 5 stars, that certainly helps as well, because it's the stars which generate or certainly contribute to where we are in the table. By all accounts, it doesn't matter what you say as far as the narrative is concerned, although we do read them. We always try to pick up on the feedback. So you could say you'd rather the show was presented by Nick DeMarco and perhaps Sean Ryder from the Happy Mondays, and I think that would be an absolutely fantastic show. That would get my twisting my melon man for certain.
Oh, it is an image of Kieran twisting his melon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
The price of football. The price of football.